Well, good morning, everyone, dialing in online and here in the room. My name is Nicolas. I'm part of the World Bank's Global Transport Unit, and I'll try my best to guide you through this 1-hour session. This is co-hosted by the World Bank Transport Practice, as well as the Colombia Women in Energy program, which we're very grateful for. Also, thanks to the speakers who volunteered to be part of this important session. And to start off, I'd like to give the word now to Nicolas Peltier. He's the Global Director for Transport at the World Bank. And in his role, he oversees all topics around transport, from urban mobility through freight logistics, rail, aviation, and maritime. And Nicolas, if you could share your opening remarks with us.
Thank you very much, Rico. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are connecting from. Very glad to welcome you today, to both participants in the room and participants who connect virtually. I'm very pleased that we can organize this event jointly with the Women in Energy Network of Columbia University. I've been told that we have several colleagues here at the World Bank who are alumni of this Center of Global Energy Policy. And I'm therefore glad that we can organize this event together and partner on this very important agenda. The title of our session today is Kickstarting Investment into Green Transport Fuels. And I would like to briefly tell you why I think that this is a highly relevant topic for both our development and our climate agenda. First, the COP28 will start in a few weeks, as you know, in Dubai. It marks the conclusion of the first global stocktake. The global stocktake is the main mechanism to measure progress under the Paris Agreement. And the stocktake report is actually quite blunt. No? The planet is off track. Under the Paris Agreement, the world would need to reach a 43% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030. And we are not in a good place to achieve that today. Deep emissions cuts can only be achieved through a significant ramping up of renewables and clean fuels like hydrogen or ammonia. For transport, the stocktake report calls for mitigation measures, which are system transforming. And for deep sea shipping, and we know that deep sea shipping is one of the hard-to-abate sector. This means shifting from oil-based fuels to green ammonia or methanol. Green production routes can deliver on other sustainable development goals too, such as access to affordable electricity for all. And these are solutions that can be scaled up and replicated across regions. However, what we are missing today is the scale and the speed. We've mapped out the technology pathways for the hard-to-abate sectors, like shipping, but investments are not happening at the pace and at the scale that is required. For deep sea shipping, for example, hydrogen-based fuels should make up 64% of the energy mix by 2050. By 2030, governments have already committed that at least 5% of ships will run on zero-emission fuels. To put this into a perspective, this would mean displacing 15 million tons of heavy fuel oil. And this in turn will equate producing around 5 million tons of hydrogen for shipping alone in only 6 years' time. At the global level, we've seen a lot of ambitious statements regarding the production of hydrogen, green hydrogen, but only very few projects have yet reached financial close. And this is mainly due to the absence of long-term offtake agreements and the high production costs. The problem is that ambition statements alone are not bankable. And at the same time, for many developing countries with renewable resources, the green hydrogen economy could become a unique value proposition. And a growing number of our client governments have already expressed interest for this agenda, and they've approached us at the World Bank, both on the energy and on the transport side. If well planned and implemented, this new industry could potentially create quality jobs, add affordable and clean electricity to the grid, generate revenues, and finally allow heavy industry and transport to cut greenhouse gas and air pollution. 2 weeks before the start of the COP, it's useful to take stock of the barriers and enablers to advance this agenda. In today's session, we will look at this through 3 different lenses. First, from the perspective of private developers, second, from the perspective of technology providers, and finally, from the lens of development finance. The ambitions should be clear. We must kickstart this transition, de-risk first mover projects, and deliver on our climate goals. I'll stop there. I'm sorry I won't be able to stay for the full session, but I wish you a fruitful discussion, and again, a very warm welcome to all those present today in the room and virtually. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. And like we said, this is co-hosted by the Women in Energy program. And I would like to ask Jessica Weiss, she's the program director of this initiative at Columbia, to come in and share a few thoughts how this program, what this program does. And like Nicolas said, we have a few alumni at the bank actually who are part of this network. Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm the program director for the Women in Energy Initiative at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. We host events and inform to connect underrepresented groups to the energy sector. We do that through events. We do that through a newsletter that reaches about 6,000 people that offer career and internship opportunities. And we're also working to develop a program to support professional women in energy who are currently working in the energy sector. Tomorrow, as an example, we have an event on allyship in New York City featuring Jason Bordoff, our founding director. If anyone's in New York and interested in attending, you can reach out to me at womenenergy@columbia.edu. If you'd like to talk about any of the things that I've just shared, I'm happy to go into depth, but I'm just so happy to be here and really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica. And we have quite some tight schedule today, but I'm very pleased that Sebnem of the World Bank, that Sundus from Topsoe, and Joel have agreed to share a few thoughts, and just let you know what you will be expecting in the next 45 minutes, a brief overview of what we're going to look at. And like Nicolas already introduced, we have the privilege of having different perspectives today in the room, not just the World Bank view and not just a private commercial view, but look at this topic and this challenge from 3 lenses. Joe is going to share the commercial developers view with us. Sundus, dialing in from Denmark, I suppose, will be giving us the perspective from a commercial technology provider in the space of nascent hydrogen fuel cell technology. And we'll be joined by Sebnem later on to bring this all together in a little panel discussion where we look at the barriers and how financing and MDBs can potentially support this transition. At the end, we hopefully have some minutes left for a Q&A for those here in the room, but also for the audience dialing in virtually. And without any further ado, Joel, I would give the floor to you. Joel Moser is the Chief Executive Officer of First Ammonia, a private company looking to develop green fuel projects. He's also a lecturer at Columbia School of International Policy and Public Affairs, and a frequent contributor on investment and infrastructure topics in the Washington Post, the Brookings Institute, and the World Economic Forum. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this. This is a very timely topic. My colleague, Anne-Catherine Mers, who's on, is actually a member of the Women in Energy program, a graduate of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, is going to help with the slides. But very simply, we believe, and based upon comments made by representatives of the World Bank at a recent forum at Columbia, the World Bank agrees that ammonia will play an essential role in decarbonizing marine transportation, as was mentioned earlier, an extremely hard to abate space. Next slide, please. Maritime's growth and emissions is unsustainable in a world that we're going to attempt to decarbonize by whatever goals you set, 2050, 2035. marine transportation currently causes about 3% of greenhouse gas emissions. Bunker fuel is among the dirtiest fuels in the world, and carbon is not the only culprit here. There are particulate matters, other chemicals that are emitted into the atmosphere by the current use of marine fuels. So it is an area that is ripe for transition and ready for transition. There will be a number of transition fuels, and I'm, of course, as the CEO of First Ammonia, I'm going to talk about ammonia, but I want to first say a word about e-methanol. We are very supportive of our colleagues who are developing methanol. E-methanol is going to be the first green transition fuel. There are already methanol ships sailing. Maersk has been a leader in this area, and you'll hear more about this a little bit, I think, from my colleague from Topsoe, Sundus, who also has played a role in this transition. But we see at First Ammonia methanol as a transition to the transition. It's a transition fuel to the transition. E-methanol, much cleaner than bunker fuel. E-methanol made from hydrogen electrolyzed from water, particularly if the carbon that's attached to that hydrogen is of biological origin. But methanol, as the slide shows, has a carbon problem. Methanol is a hydrocarbon, and in my view is if the objective is decarbonization, the objective must be to stop burning hydrocarbons of whatever source. Next slide, AK. Methanol's, in addition to that challenge, methanol's ability to scale as a green fuel will ultimately be limited. We're talking about very few ships sailing now, and it is a beginning. But the carbon molecules for methanol, if it's going to be produced electronically from water, must be sourced somewhere. And to be green, one would imagine it should be sourced from biomass. The problem is that there is a limited amount of carbon that's going to be sourced in this fashion. A few months ago, there was a panel at Columbia for transportation fuels generally, a session on air transport and a session on marine transport. Representatives of the industry, academia, policy sector, and the air transport sector focused all on drop-in fuels. They need drop-in fuels. There are thousands upon thousands of planes flying. The airline industry is chronically bankrupt. It would be an incredible undertaking to transform the fleet of airplanes around the world to carbon-free fuel. So they want drop-in fuel, and they said, all of them, please don't use our carbon for marine fuel. We need all that for our drop-in air fuel. So there's a challenge with that. I mean, there's lots of carbon. You can get carbon out of the air with direct air capture, but direct air capture is energy intensive. And I'm going to say something that I always say when I speak publicly. If you can capture carbon, put it in the ground, don't put it back into the air. The objective of decarbonization is to reduce the amount of carbon in the air. So the objective of green fuels should be to stop burning hydrocarbons. Okay. There are only two carbon-free fuels, hydrogen and ammonia. And as you can see, hydrogen H2, ammonia NH3. Ammonia, I will sometimes say, has got more hydrogen than hydrogen. Ammonia is a calmer fuel than hydrogen, and easier to use, easier to transport. And as you'll see in the next slide, much less expensive to manage. I won't go through these numbers, but the bottom line is that ammonia is about 30 times less expensive to store than hydrogen. Hydrogen is an extremely volatile molecule. Ammonia is not. Ammonia can be stored at room temperature. It can be transported easily, in fact, is. In fact, in this world where we're talking about a hydrogen transformation, it is expected that 85% of the export-oriented hydrogen will actually move around by sea as ammonia. Ammonia is the way to move hydrogen around, and in my view, it's the way to use it as a fuel. The challenge with hydrogen is that it's the smallest molecule, it is highly volatile, and it escapes. I mean, one other challenge with hydrogen is that when it is not itself a greenhouse gas, but when it interacts with the atmosphere, it combines with other molecules to form greenhouse gases. So I think hydrogen is a complicated and, in my view, ultimately a dangerous fuel to use on large scale on applications such as marine transportation. By contrast, ammonia has been handled, has been produced industrially, has been handled, transported on a large scale for almost 100 years. About 185 million metric tons of ammonia are produced each year. That will grow for its current primary uses, which is about 70% for fertilizer and refrigeration and chemicals. About 20% of that already floats. The world knows how to handle ammonia. On the next slide, we have a little bit of background noise from somebody. Maybe you should go on mute, please. Thank you. There is an existing network to trade, to transport, to store ammonia. For its current uses, of course, this will need to grow. But it's something we know how to do, and most major ports have ammonia storage in place. The most likely first use of ammonia as a fuel will be in ammonia carriers, just the way LNG uses its own cargo as a fuel. Ammonia cargo transports will be using ammonia as a fuel. Lots of things have to happen, though, before this falls into place, as you'll see on the next slide. Ammonia bunkering is going to require regulatory change in every country. There isn't a country in the world that currently has, at a major port, regulations in place for the safe handling of ammonia for bunkering. They may have ammonia storage as cargo. In fact, a lot of the folks that are saying we don't know how to handle and allow ammonia to be used in our ships don't even know that they're storing ammonia in their ports. But I don't want to make light of it. Ammonia is a toxic gas. It requires safe handling. We know how to handle it safely. It's been handled safely for decades, but there will need to be changes made. And the way this is starting to happen is along highly trafficked routes. And the Singapore Marine Port Authority is leading the way, not surprisingly, not only because Singapore is often the leader in these things, but because it's the largest bunkering site in the entire world. So fast growth is possible, as there has been and will continue to be growth in LNG bunkering. Next slide, okay. We talked, there was a comment made earlier about offtakes. Well, offtakes are the special sauce to grow a new industry that's producing a product that's capital intensive to produce. We need offtakes in order for our facilities to get financed. There's been somewhat of reluctance by the marine industry to enter into offtakes, but not just offtakes, long-term offtakes. Long-term offtakes, as the World Bank folks know, are what's required to get capital-intensive project financed. And it makes sense, though, because the ships that will be built to use this fuel will have a long lifetime. So there's a synergistic potential for long-term offtakes, but this is what needs to be put in place increasingly, and we're starting to see some of these. Next slide, okay. Ammonia, however, is already starting to play a role in maritime. We have ammonia ships that will be sailing by 2026, probably dual fuel, as the e-methanol ships are dual fuel. It's happening by several leading shipbuilders and carriers. Brooklyn Navy Yard-based Ammonia is already retrofitting a tugboat that will run on ammonia. fueled fuel cell. By the end of this year, we anticipate that Ammogia's ammonia tugboats may push ammonia barges from our first facility, which will be in Texas, which is, I think, a good segue, if I recall, to a little bit of a word about us on our first facility. So we are approaching the production of ammonia at scale, what we think is a well-suited manner for the marine industry. First of all, we've selected the world's best electrolyzers. And if I can just say a word about my friend and colleague from Topsoe, we believe that solid oxide electrolyzer cells will be the future of hydrogen and hydrogen derivative production. They are the lowest consumer of electricity because they are the most efficient. Particularly for the production of ammonia, there's a potential to integrate the exothermic heat ammonia production to even further the amount of savings in hydrogen production. And there are no rare earth metals materials used in solid oxide electrolyzer cells, as in, for example, PEM, another alternative. So we think the future is solid oxide. We think Topsoe is the perfect company to be producing these. That's why we've entered into a long-term partnership with Topsoe for our facilities. There are economies of scale in the production of ammonia. Larger facilities benefit from economies of scale for supporting infrastructure. So the very large scale production that ultimately will be demanded to decarbonize the marine sector with ammonia is synergistic with the economics of producing our product. And finally, we've designed modular plants which can easily be dropped into any location around the world rapidly. And this is going to be interesting for the countries in the world that the World Bank supports. Very quickly about our first site. The IRA is a very powerful economic incentive to the production of green hydrogen and thus green ammonia. So we have selected our site in Port Victoria, Texas, as our flagship site. We'll be installing Topsoe's electrolyzers there. Our first site will easily support up to 500 megawatts of production. And a couple of weeks ago in Berlin, we announced our first offtake with the German power utility Uniper. You see a bad photo of me there alongside Sundus's colleague Kim Hedegaard, who graciously joined us for the announcement, Lance Titus from Uniper. So we're delighted to be in partnership not only with Topsoe, but with Uniper. And finally, on the next slide, while we will produce our first product in Texas, we have sites in our pipeline globally. And in many of these locations are countries which will require and benefit from support from the World Bank. And while the IRA is a very powerful incentive, it sort of sets the bar for production cost. It's not the only place in the world where this product will be produced. In fact, there will be many energy exporting countries around the world, countries that can produce more renewable power than they can consume, and they will export that power as ammonia. I know that sounds strange, but it's simply a fact. They'll produce hydrogen, they'll convert it to ammonia for export. It will be imported around the world. Wherever you hear about hydrogen import facilities, they're really ammonia import facilities, the first few being put into Germany. Some of that ammonia will get cracked back into hydrogen, some of it will be used directly as ammonia. Why produce hydrogen ammonia someplace besides the US when the IRA is so powerful? Well, there are places in the world that are very windy, very sunny, have potential for very low cost renewable power, sometimes at very high capacity factors, places where there's 24/7 hydropower, geothermal power. These are the places that will also be producing green hydrogen in the future. We can put plants anywhere. The World Bank is going to play a big role in these developing countries. So with that, I think I'll close my remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. This was very insightful. And in the interest of time, I would move directly to Sundus. Sundus, thanks very much for making the time. Sundus Cornelia Ramli, she's the Chief Commercial Officer of Topsoe, a Denmark-based company active in the space of electrolyzer technology. And apart from that, I heard she's also an advocate for more diversity in the science and engineering, because I think you are an astrophysicist by training. So over to you, Colin.
Yes, I'm far away from what I did a couple of decades ago to where I am today, definitely. But moving from looking at photons into electrons and then into molecules is pretty exciting in the Power-to-X space. I will just share my screen. One moment. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, it's coming up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oop, it's kind of hanging on my side. 1 second. Oops. What do you see? Do you see a presentation mode, or do you see the actual slide?
You see the presentation mode now. The presentation mode is coming up.
Sorry?
Yes. No. See presentation mode.
Correct mode, yeah.
Okay, you can see the slides. Okay, perfect. Oh, great. All right. So I think before we get started on the technology side, many people do not know who Topsoe is. So I think it's worth just spending a few minutes to explain a little bit who we are and why we feel that we're a little bit different to the other players out there. So Topsoe is a company that is not new. It is quite old. It is 80 years, built on innovation and leading in innovation. And everything that has been done since 80 years ago is all about what they call perfecting chemistry for a better world. And I'll touch upon this in the next few slides. Today, we have a huge ambition to lead the global transition of the hard-to-abate sectors to a net zero future. So we are quite lucky that we're standing on decades of R&D, and hence in a very unique position to be able to accelerate the transition of this sustainable technology. So we call ourselves a little bit like a climate tech company. We've been in the past #1 in renewable fuels, low carbon hydrogen. We're a modest company of 2,000 plus employees globally, with 1 billion in revenue in US dollars. What's very unique to this company is that we reinvest almost 9 to 10% of our revenues yearly back into R&D. You don't see that so much in the energy companies. You tend to see this in pharmaceutical, but we continuously do that because we believe that the heart of being able to produce better products and technologies in order to decarbonize the world is through R&D. Of course, we have a lot of patents out there, and we continuously yearly increase this number year by year. So where we started off in the 1940s was that there was this whole desire to solve different world's toughest challenges. If you look in the 1950s, there was a huge problem with growing populations, but there was a huge pressure on food supply. So having a very efficient way of producing fertilizers, so i.e. using ammonia technology to produce fertilizer, was a big world challenge that would need to be solved. And that was what Dr. Harder Topsoe himself started off his career with, and then went on to come up with a very nice technology that we still use until today. In the 80s, there was a huge problem with acid rain. So there, again, a technology came out on how to remove sulfur from the atmosphere. 90s was air pollution. So how do we ensure that any type of coal plants out there has the cleanest air solution? The 2000s was all about fuels in a most sustainable way. And then where we are now in this decade and in the future, it is all about decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors. So as a company, Topsoe is very motivated by solving the world's toughest challenge, where today it is about climate change. And so, of course, very lucky to be sitting on all the building blocks that can support the decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sectors. We have the fuel side, we have hydrogen technology, we have ammonia technologies, methanol technologies, electrofuels, and so on. Let's get this one here. So just to give a summary of what we do, so it's not just the hydrogen, the green hydrogen component, but it is everything else that what we call the derivatives, the fuels, the green chemicals, the green fuels, sustainability, aviation fuels, etc. So what we always say, if you have the power, we can deliver the X that you need. We have, of course, the core of the whole value chain is the green hydrogen technology that we have, which is in the form of a solid oxide, what we short form as a SOEC. And then, of course, down there, we also have ammonia, methanol, etc. So I won't go into too much details on this. Good. So Last year, we took financial investment decision on the world's largest SOEC factory because we believed that we needed to take that decision fast in order to have speed in the market to support the first movers like First Ammonia to deploy Power-to-X plants in order to start decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors. This facility will produce an initial 500 megawatt per year with the option to expand annual production to 5 gigawatt. To give context into this, currently the largest installed capacity of electrolyzer globally is 20 megawatt. So 500 megawatt per year is quite big in the scale of where we are, but not big enough in the scale of how we need to decarbonize. The first production will come out in January 2025, whereby First Ammonia will be one of our first customers for delivery at the end of the year. So what is the SOEC electrolyzer solution? Unique about the SOEC is that it consists of cells that enables high temperature electrolysis. This technology then is able to provide solutions that can integrate to what we call downstream processes. So meaning that we can utilize heat integration, steam integration from ammonia, steel plants, etc., in order to be more efficient. So in the end, you utilize less electricity. And most people know that the biggest cost is the cost of electricity, the procurement of PPAs, access to green power, which is the biggest cost in the Power-to-X plant business case. So we are 30% more efficient than the other technologies. And for each SOEC unit, try to illustrate here, is a 5 megawatt building block, which means that you can stack it together. So you can take them into 5 megawatt scale. We also have a very modular solution, and which enables production capacities for plants in the megawatt range if needed, and then also in the gigawatt range. There are no precious metals that is utilized here, and therefore it's very highly scalable. A lot of people think SOEC is very, very new. So for us, it's not new. It is very old. We've had this in our little R&D box and also in pilot production, etc., back in the 1980s, whereby it was what we call solid oxide fuel cell. At that time, we believe the market was more towards SOFC, whereas today it is SOEC. The focus then shifted to SOEC in 2015, and we've been demonstrating and industrializing the SOEC unit since 2015 and doing continuous optimization and innovation here. And of course, in 2022, as mentioned, we took a financial investment decision for the factory to produce SOEC stacks. So this is to illustrate the efficiency that you see when you compare an SOEC electrolyzer solution to the other technologies out there. And due to the high temperature that is utilized, the amount of efficiency, when you look at the consumption of electricity per produced molecule of product hydrogen, the SOEC is much more highly efficient. So, and then we talk about there are some challenges when you move certain technologies like ammonia. So we've been doing ammonia plants since the 1980s, and now you look into the application of ammonia in a new environment. The new environment here is the fact that we have renewable power production, which is fluctuating. It is very variable, which causes unbalanced power production. In the past, you have a constant stream of, say, natural gas, so it was a little bit more simpler. So what we have done is that we've also sort of innovated further and came up with a technology or an improvement to our ammonia technology, which is able to operate dynamically according to the fluctuation of the electricity that we have. So one of the advantages that we have in our power to ammonia plant is that it's fully flexible. It goes all the way down to 10% plant load and all the way up to 100%. It can ramp up and down super fast, which means that you don't need to store the hydrogen either. So you can store the energy instead as ammonia and then transport it when you need to, or you can also utilize it as a grid balancing as well. We are currently constructing our first demonstration unit to utilize, to demonstrate this dynamic operation of our ammonia plant. And this is expected to be commissioned in the end of 2024. And then if we go to the next thing that we do, which Joel, you kindly mentioned as well, this modular plants that we do. Of course, coming from Denmark, we're very famous with Lego. So we want to make everything Lego as well. And so all of our technologies, including the hydrogen, the ammonia, the methanol standard solutions, are what we call the modulite solution, which is Lego sets for smaller scale. And what this means is that when you have areas whereby installation costs and labor costs is very high, this reduces the cost and risk of installation compared to when you build everything all the way from scratch at site. And it's also a very clear cost for developers throughout the development process, because the ability to be able to give a final firm price just slightly before FID is important for First Ammonia, for example, as a developer, and therefore we're able to do that as well. And of course, having standard solutions means there is risk reduction. You can increase bankability and showcase that the next plant is the same as the last plant. We are also now speaking about shipping. We are similar to Joel. We of course have very big bets and big hopes for ammonia. Ammonia is definitely the most resilient fuel out there. You don't need a carbon source, and that you only need air, nitrogen, solar, wind, etc. But throughout the transition, there needs to be other solutions as well, and e-methanol is one of them. And we are actually one of the first companies or technology providers for the largest e-methanol plant in Northern Europe. Actually, we think in the world right now, bar China. And this is in construction right now, and it will be producing 50,000 tons of e-methanol per year for the shipping industry. This will be ready in 2025. And with First Ammonia, we are going to deploy a first-of-a-kind industrial-scale power-to-ammonia using SOEC with expectations of COD in 2025. So just bridging a little bit to the panel discussions later. I mean, there is a lot of things that we look at as a technology provider, which is some key considerations, because a lot of these plants that we're talking about right now, in order to be able to produce more, there are what we call first-of-a-kind facilities. There are certain perceived risk profile that needs to be considered. And as a technology provider, what we look at is that a lot of people look at this as they have a higher perceived risk because they believe that these are all new technologies. For us, of course, there is a lot of technologies that is in an application of a new world. So an application with power grids as opposed to natural gas. We look for customers and product developers, utility owners, etc., that has a higher emphasis on collaboration. So therefore, we can't go out there and contract the same way as we do when things are already in the mass market. So we look for early innovators, early adopters, like First Ammonia, in order to collaborate further, because there's a high emphasis on IPR. There are different cost considerations and also different ways of challenging bankability requirements for these type of plans. I will end there.
Thanks very much,
Thank you.
Sundus. This was very insightful. Thanks for your perspective here. We want to jump, because we don't have too much time left, but I still want to jump into the challenges which we are facing, and I think which keeps us busy thinking around how we can solve those. And one of them relates to the fact that we are all aware that we kind of need ammonia, methanol, hydrogen-based fuels for the shipping sector, for aviation, and so on. But we don't really see it coming online just yet. And for a little discussion here, I'd like to start off with one slide. And this shows, it's a study by Bloomberg, just released the other week. And Bloomberg is tracking the pipeline of hydrogen projects globally. They do not only track the pipeline of potential projects coming online, but also they track the number of offtake agreements, meaning how many offtake agreements are there as compared to the announced pipeline. And it turns out that these 148 offtake agreements, that only, that I think it's only 10% of those offtake agreements, the 10% of the pipeline actually has an offtake agreement. And out of that 10%, 80% of those are memorandums of understanding, and where the remaining 20% is even unspecified. And that first question should quickly go to Joe. Maybe you can tell us something about the investing environment we are in and why this is so. A brief answer, please.
The demand is not as strong as the potential. The IRA is a very strong stimulant for production, which is great. It reduces the cost, but to get things financed, there needs to be a market for the product. The world, the financial markets abhor the if you build it, they will come principle of development. They need to be there or be contracted to be there for the money to come for the development. We have spoken, I think, to virtually every company in the world that is interested in being an off-taker for green ammonia. Several are ready to engage now. Many are talking about 2030. The demand, I think, must begin from the ultimate users of the product. So the shippers are saying, we don't want to be caught in the middle, building ships and buying fuel if our customers, the folks for whom we move goods, aren't agreeing to pay us, frankly, more for a low carbon or decarbonized carriage. Same thing for all the other uses. So very quickly, the current uses for our product that are in demand, that are being contracted for, are not in the energy space and not in the transportation space. It's in the chemical space. It's places where ammonia is in current use. The only way to decarbonize that product is to have a decarbonized ammonia. We hear, we need to see those ships built. We need to see the contracts let for long-term transport at low carbon, which will then ultimately lead to the demand for our fuel at scale.
When we talk with our clients, and I think it's not a secret that the hydrogen economy in many geographies is the economy which has a future to create high quality jobs in the developing world, especially those countries with renewable resources. It's a value proposition lots of our client countries are banking on these days and put out a hope for. Now in this early stage of the transition, and in fact we're in 2024 almost, and 2030 is one of the milestones when we should have reached 43% of emissions reductions across sectors. How do we continue telling the story? And Sebnem, I would like you to come in here. How can MDBs, what's the role of MDBs to de-risk it and make this happen?
Sure. So let me take a shot at this. And there are a number of different ways we're looking at de-risking. But in terms of the problem, I think that's been defined over and over during this panel already, which is we have these emerging markets, and we can see in this chart here, which have at least the solar potential. I'm sure a number of these have the wind potential as well, but they're not quite converting into investments with the right sort of offtake agreements. And there are a number of risks around that. So perhaps to start with, when we work in these emerging markets, first and foremost, country risk is a big issue for bankability. So that's that can be defined as macro, fiscal, political, and FX risks. So those are paramount. Then you add on to these issues potentially around institutional capacity, regulatory frameworks, and things like that. So there is a somewhat challenging environment then going into a G7 country and making an investment. And then, of course, with hydrogen, there are various issues there, or at least, I mean, it's great to hear all of this in terms of the technology developing and maturing, but that's still seen as somewhat of a challenge, technology plus offtake risks. So certainly addressing all of these could help reduce the overall cost of producing the renewables, the associated plants for the production of hydrogen and ammonia. But frankly, it's not an overnight job. There are many layers to that. And the way we usually describe this is upstream to downstream. So we would really start with the country environment, and in this case, more specifically, what is the environment for making these investments? Can we introduce some stability into that to do sectoral engagements, macro engagements, regulatory engagements? And the bank and all MDBs are quite active in this space. We did the largest development policy operation in India, 3 billion, I believe, to support the investment in hydrogen, the government's program. So that's one way of us intervening in the policy and enabling environment space. The other most important thing is demand creation. So a number of these, and for example, Global Infrastructure Facility is working with a number of MDBs in Egypt, in Namibia, and I think there's one other place. And we're aware of various Namibia, South Africa, I believe, Mauritania, Morocco. So there are a number of countries where we are looking at project design and preparation support to help get these off the ground. Now, again, there are MOUs, but there aren't locked in offtake contracts. So what we're also realizing is, it's very good to try and develop this global demand, which requires the product to be shipped somewhere else. But in parallel, to make sure that the numbers work financially and economically, it's also very important to create demand domestically. So it's global as well as domestic demand creation. And there it gets down to things like mandatory green consumption in end user sectors, certifications and standards, various labeling norms and things like that, and potentially taxes on fossil fuel consumption, which will then lead to more demand picking up for the end products and create those offtake contracts, either merchant markets or longer term offtake contracts. We see that as a critical thing now. We are facing political economy issues because that increases the cost of everything and it leads to inflation and potentially more macro strains in an environment where these economies are now way more severely constrained than before for various reasons that we're aware of. But that is one area of work. Another thing MDBs could do, and the bank is also looking at it, is supporting creation of SOE aggregators who could take the production and then sell it on. There's a lot of work to be done there to make sure these are credible entities with the right sort of setup to facilitate these this type of hydrogen purchase and supply arrangement. Now, last but not least, and close to my heart, is risk-sharing arrangements. So the MDBs have a number of products, and bank, of course, is leading on this through our loans, but also guarantees and various trust funds to provide de-risking. And we can do this at many levels for these these are large-scale investments at the end of the day with multiple components. So depending on what we are looking at, we could come in and help SOEs in terms of creditworthiness, maybe raising debt to put in their own money or participate in equity of these investments. We have payment guarantees. So if there are offtake contracts by an incumbent domestic entity, we can look at mitigating credit risk of that for the longer term, the duration of the PPA. We have done this in many places, especially in the production of renewables. We have a number of programmatic approaches in different countries. Argentina is an excellent example. Uzbekistan is another, and various others where we've been able to really move the needle on renewables investment and increase production. And very relevant to this sector is risk-sharing facilities. Also, given the modular nature of the investment and the value chain, we find that there is a need, especially in local currency, but could also be looking at hard currency, providing risk-sharing through financial intermediaries or local banks or even international banks to help these investments get off the ground. And we have also devised an approach, we call it a liquidity support mechanism for projects to mitigate issues around the new technologies. So all in all, it's a heavy lift. It's a package of interventions upstream to downstream to get this going. We already have examples in Chile where we've been working on a hydrogen risk-sharing facility, which has a bank loan for part of the capex, as well as a liquidity line to mobilize private capital. In India, not quite hydrogen or ammonia, but we're looking at compressed biogas risk-sharing facility to then use this as a transport fuel. So many examples. And last but not least, carbon markets. So this is another area of development where we could support the growth and lead to additional financing for these investments. So full menu and a lot of work.
Thanks, Sebnem. Definitely a lot of work. And the two components, and you mentioned one of them, is the production cost and the offtake, which currently is sort of a barrier in really making this hydrogen market emerge at scale. On the cost side, one of the components is that that the cost of capital is very high in our developing countries, in our client countries, given the inherent country risk and other risks you mentioned, where we have tools to mitigate them to some extent. The other component you mentioned is technology risk. And I think we have this notion in the hydrogen space that the technology will become cheaper over time. That's what we keep on modeling in sort of long-term energy transition models. We assume that the cost of hydrogen production would come down because of technology. And this would lead me to this chart I put up here on the screen. And that question will go to Sebnem, to Sundus. Lots of people starting with S here. And that shows the anticipated cost of hydrogen production, and especially here electrolyzer. I'm personally wondering, if we don't see these projects taking place, meaning that technology we keep talking about is not actually sold in the market, how can we realistically get the cost really down of it? It's about, I hear arguments like experience building, improvement of technology, but if that technology isn't used, how can we improve it? Maybe Sundus, you can share a bit what kind of efficiency gains and cost reductions on the technology side, on the CAPEX side, can we actually expect?
Yeah, I think, so yes, the technology electrolyzer component is a big component, but if you're looking at the costs of production of hydrogen in this chart that you're doing, actually it's not the biggest component, right? There's other factors there. But speaking about technology efficiencies and why we believe, at least for SOEC, so I can't speak too much on alkaline and others, but for SOEC, if you look at this technology that is being deployed today, there isn't much out there yet. And the improvements really, there will be improvements coming from supply chain, EPC costs, and designing once, building many, But the biggest cost reduction will come from performance. You are at the very start of the cost journey right now with SOECs, and it's just going to keep on going down because this is a chemistry, surface chemistry, right? The process will just improve. You have more cells that you can stack up to each other. You have more throughput, more current density that can increase in efficiency. So I do believe, at least for SOEC, we have a much steeper cost out journey than the competitors, purely because it is a complex chemistry that you're utilizing, that you've just started on that journey.
So that
Yeah.
the scale effects will occur in the technology itself and not in the production of the mass production. This is the scale.
Yeah, there will be, of course, there is always going to be on the supply chain, you're sourcing from low countries and you're building it bigger and larger, etc. But a very, very large component is performance based.
Thanks very much. We have not too many minutes left, but I think around 8 minutes. And I'd like to open the floor here in the room, first of all, for questions. And I see one hand here on two sides of the table. We start with William Raja, Practice Manager for Transport here at the World Bank.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. First of all, this has been really a good learning session. Well done, Maritime team, as always, and new and innovative topics that are really giving us a new learning. I was just curious about the offtake agreements. In looking at the aviation sector, yesterday there was a similar event actually where I spoke. In the aviation space, the SAF, all the future production, they have 100% offtake agreement. Actually, the demand is there. All their airlines are signing up to whatever production is going to be there. So it was interesting why we have only 10%, even at that, majority are MOUs. I think it's an important point to dig a little bit into that space and see why the demand is not coming. Is it because perhaps from the shipping company's point of view, they also have to invest on their, basically buying new ships or building new ships, which really expose them to huge risk. So I'm not sure it's just about the hydrogen cost or the production. The risk is really right there, because I think in the airline and aviation, it's drop-in fuel. They don't need to change their Boeing 747, still will fly, and nothing will happen. But here, Maersk has to buy new ships and others have to buy new ships. So how do you really overcome that risk at that point in time is where I think something maybe we need to look into deeper.
Maybe Joel, you can quickly comment on this, because you have had a lot of discussions with potential off-takers. And I think shipping itself is a very unique sector. It's very policy driven. But then, of course, you do have those situations where a shipping line must make investments on the shipboard side as well. Is that a barrier, or is it rather the uncertainty around what's my carbon intensity? What does my carbon intensity have to look like by 2030, so I can plan ahead and meet that target? Joel.
I don't think it's a barrier so much as it's a speed bump. You gave the answer in the question, which is that in the aviation, it is a drop-in fuel. Yeah. It produces a fuel that is essentially, at the end of the day, the same chemically or virtually the same as the fuel it's replacing. So it's easy to do it. Whether it's e-methanol or ammonia, the ships need to be designed from scratch, built from scratch. So it's slower. And so it is the regulatory environment, the demands of the IMO, carbon pricing, demand by consumers for a carbon intensity scale that will cause the shipbuilders to make the decisions to build the new ships, and then they will need to anticipate the need for the fuel, and it's a slower process.
Thanks, Joe. We have one more question in the room. I'd like to take this first of all. Dominic, would you want to come in?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That has been very intriguing. And Joel, shame on you. I think you've stolen my talking points at some point of time from somewhere. I don't know how you got access to my notes, but that's usually what I'm presenting to different kind of audiences. Especially regarding kind of, the pros and cons of methanol against ammonia. One recurrent argument against ammonia, and you've already alluded to this, is the toxicity. It's this issue that we have there. And so far, me too, in the past, I've mostly brought up, it has already been widely traded around the globe and so on, there's experience and so on and so on. I personally haven't been able to drill down a little bit deeper. So can you give me as a kind of compensation for having stolen my talking points, now some talking points, what kind of specific solutions or specific ideas and concepts would I or others be able to give out to the audience and say, but one ammonia accident in the North Sea or in the Atlantic or wherever can actually destroy how many wildlife species and so on in the water. What can be done and what needs to be done, except for we need better safety concepts? What needs to be done specifically in order to prevent this? Also, very often the human health issue comes up, the occupational hazards and so on. What are the three kind of killer counter arguments that I'm going to put forward in the future?
Sundus, do you want to answer that, or shall I?
You can go ahead and I'll add.
We only have a minute or less.
Yeah.
20% of the 185 million metric tons of ammonia that's produced and used in the world today is currently afloat. We're very comfortable moving ammonia around. As far as using as a fuel on ships, it's just about design. You've seen some of the designs of the ammonia ships. The tanks are above board as opposed to below, because if there's a leakage, it goes into the air. It's really about design and safety and engineering. It is a fuel which can be made safe. Nothing is perfectly safe. Hydrogen's explosive. Carbon products are flammable. Ammonia is toxic. We need, each one requires its own safety mitigants.
Fantastic. I think we really have very little time left. Is there one last question in the room? Colleen, you had one. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for such great presentations. I think this is one of the clearest explanations that I've seen on ammonia and how it will relate to maritime decarbonization. So my question was actually on the process for electrolysis that Topsoe is doing, because it's also water intensive. So I was just wondering where you sourcing your water, especially if you're going to be working with developing countries where water is scarce.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe from the water, it's more where does Joel, where are you, Joel, going to be sourcing your water? But in developing countries, what we're looking into, at least for most of the project developers, are looking at desalination technologies in order to desalinize the water instead, right? So, but we are all very aware in the power to X industry that there is a challenge, not a challenge, but there is something that we need to be very aware when we go into gigawatt scales and what do we do about the source of water. But if you look at how much water is being utilized today in oil and gas, it makes power to X utilization of water so insignificant in comparison. So I think there is going to be a challenge, but the challenge has always been there, and we do believe that we will be able to solve it.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for answering these questions. We will respond to the questions in the chat separately, but I have one final last question. I just would kindly ask you to answer it in one sentence. Hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels are always considered to be the champagne of the fuels. They are scarce, the resources are scarce, and they're expensive. And I think, Dominic, you have this term originated here in the bank from you. But anyways, the champagne of fuels, hydrogen. Who's missing at the tasting table today so that we can drink the champagne by 2030? Who and why? Sebnem. Who's missing today?
Cheers.
I think, okay. So look, I'm at two minds for this. I would say capital is missing, but at the same time, I would say we know very well for capital to come in, these upstream things first and foremost need to be in place, especially enabling regulations, the regulations around end use, maybe carbon taxes and things like that. So I'm going to have to say governments first and foremost are missing because they are the decision makers on all these important initiatives.
All right, thank you. Government has to sit at the table. Sundus, who has to sit at the table else?
The same regulators. They play a very important role here, not only to give speed and etc. to these type of projects, but also to remove other types of subsidies that should not be in there. Because right now we have a very wrong perception of how expensive green products are when you compare to grey products due to other subsidies that are in place for fossil fuels. So let's make the level playing field much more accurate.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Joel, your final word.
I'm going to make it.
With?
I'm going to make it unanimous, government, and particularly government to stimulate the demand. The EU is leading the way with the RFNBO standards and RED 3, but the entire world, particularly the United States, which is not, which has stimulated production, but we can go, we can get there with demand stimulation, with regulation, with carbon taxes, with frankly mandates to reduce carbon intensity of products, which will lead ultimately the demand for the production of the fuels and other substances, which can result in that reduced carbon intensity.
I think that was pretty clear from each of the presenters. Thank you very much. We come to the end of the session. Thank you, Sebnem. Thank you, Sundus. Thank you, Joe, and also the team in the background who've prepared with us this event in advance. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll be in touch. And there's certainly going to be a follow-up in this or the other way. Thanks very much, everybody, for dialing in.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.